Right now, across Eastern Europe, thousands of troops, heavy armor, and aircraft are positioned in a posture we haven't seen in decades. If you look at the deployments, both NATO and Russia appear to be bracing for a deliberate, all-out war. NATO has recently expanded its borders and shifted its forces into a high-alert status. Russia has matched this with aggressive, heavily publicized military exercises right on the alliance's doorstep. But behind closed doors, military analysts see a completely different reality. A premeditated Russian attack on NATO is highly unlikely. Moscow simply doesn't have the manpower or the economic endurance to sustain a massive conventional war, and the catastrophic costs of fighting a unified alliance offer zero strategic benefit. The danger today stems from a sequence of fatal accidents, fueled by a deeply hidden paradox. This is the escalation paradox. Both sides are taking entirely logical, defensive steps to secure their borders and prevent an invasion. But those exact defensive measures are rapidly creating the perfect conditions for an accidental conflict. On a massive scale, the threat of mutual destruction is still working. No one is going to launch an unprovoked tank assault. Because of that, the competition is being forced into ambiguous, highly volatile areas where the rules of escalation control simply don't exist. We are no longer dealing with a system driven by a grand design. The risk environment is now driven entirely by interaction. It's a setup where one side's perfectly logical defensive move causes the other to panic, destabilizing the entire region without anyone intending to do so. NATO's recent rearmament is largely a structural correction. The war in Ukraine exposed deep weaknesses in Europe's military endurance, so the alliance is desperately trying to rebuild its logistics and restock its munitions so it can actually defend itself over the long haul. This is a map showing the expansion of NATO across Europe by decade. To Russian leadership, these defensive preparations look like a deliberate, slow-motion strangulation of their strategic margin. The text highlights a crucial factor: Russian demographic pressure. With a shrinking pool of military-aged men and mounting economic friction, Russia's tolerance for uncertainty is rapidly narrowing. They are acutely aware that their leverage is slipping away. In the Kremlin's view, time is a declining asset. As NATO builds up its long-term munitions and logistics, the cost of challenging the alliance in the future becomes impossibly high. This creates a now or never logic in Moscow, where probing NATO's resolve today feels safer than waiting for the power balance to shift permanently against them. Because launching a conventional strike against a fully mobilized NATO equates to military suicide, Russia channels its aggression elsewhere. They operate in the gray zone, a space where they can inflict pain and test boundaries without ever crossing the formal threshold into war. These tactics include hacking power grids, sabotaging undersea cables, and deploying soldiers wearing unmarked uniforms. It's a strategy designed entirely around plausible deniability. When an attack can't be definitively traced back to the Kremlin, it paralyzes the response. NATO relies on consensus, and the ambiguity of these operations forces 32 separate countries to argue over what just happened and who is to blame. All of this allows for continuous, cumulative pressure. Modern conflict has moved past armored formations and into civilian communication networks and corporate infrastructure. All of this constant testing creates a phenomenon analysts call crisis compression. Because both sides keep their forces at such high readiness, directly in each other's faces, the time leaders have to actually make a decision during an emergency shrinks to almost zero. Imagine two fighter jets intercepting each other over the Baltic Sea. If one makes a dangerous maneuver, the other side has to respond instantly. They can't look weak, because maintaining their credibility is the only thing holding deterrence together. In the fog of a sudden crisis, commanders have minutes to decide whether to scramble bombers or raise alert levels. But as soon as NATO rapidly adjusts its defensive posture, Russia's own radar and intelligence networks will almost certainly misread those moves as preparation for a preemptive strike. Both sides are forced to prioritize immediate, forceful resolve over pausing to figure out what went wrong. In this incredibly compressed environment, a minor collision or a misinterpreted radar blip cascades instantly out of control. If a conflict does break out, the 20th century rules of engagement vanish. Cold War strategies focused on carefully managed, linear escalation do not account for a battlefield where the first strike might be an untraceable collapse of a national power grid. Despite their extensive wargaming, neither NATO nor Russia actually possess a realistic plan for shutting down a massive, chaotic clash once the bullets start flying. They would both struggle immensely to terminate the fighting on their own terms. Instead of a predictable, step-by-step military campaign, a modern clash would jump wildly between domains. A skirmish at a border checkpoint could trigger massive cyber attacks on civilian banks half a world away, defying any attempt at containment. Surviving this era of hypersensitivity requires a completely different approach. It demands prioritizing constant, open channels of dialogue and incredibly clear signaling over the urge to immediately retaliate during a crisis. Political leaders must be thoroughly briefed on the catastrophic costs of even a localized fight. They have to be steered away from the reflexive, chest-beating responses that are so tempting when dealing with ambiguous hybrid provocations. And crucially, NATO must deeply understand the doctrine driving Russian military leadership. Even if the West rejects Moscow's worldview, knowing exactly how they interpret the rules of engagement is the only way to accurately gauge when a critical red line is actually being approached. Global stability now rests on avoiding a single, irreversible mistake, a reactive, perfectly logical series of defensive moves that we don't realize we're making until it's too late to stop.